the story begins, as I think a lot of people know, back in 1953 with the coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the democratically elected prime minister of the country, and the reinstallation of the Shah Reza Pahlavi, who was the monarch and the son of the previous dictator. And there's actually a really great CIA history of that, declassified history of that by a guy named Donald Wilbur, where this is where they coined the phrase blowback. And he says, agents should be aware of the danger of blowback coming down the line when we do projects like this. And so then in CIA...
This is an internal history written by CIA for CIA?
Right. And later published by James Risen at the New York Times.
Huh.
And so as there's a former CIA analyst named Chalmers Johnson who turned a great opponent of empire in his later years after the Cold War. But he explained, he had been a professor at USC and a contract analyst for CIA. And he explained that blowback really meant not just consequences, but it meant the long-term consequences of secret foreign policies. So when they come due, the American public at large is unaware of the true causes and are then left open or susceptible to misleading interpretations of what's happening. So then the Iranian Revolution in 1979 is the perfect example of that. If you ask people of that generation who were around then, all they remember is Iranians chanting death to America and burning American flags.
Exactly.
These people hate us. But that's the beginning of the story for most people there, even if they go back. But that was actually 26 years after America had installed a dictator to rule over those people. And in fact, when Nixon started getting us out of Vietnam, he realized he needed to bribe the military-industrial complex in another way. And so he started putting pressure on the Shah to increase weapons purchases from the United States, which he really couldn't afford and helped to undermine his rule. This is where the Iranians got their F-4s and F-14s from, was from Nixon and Ford during that time. And then there's a famous clip.
His military spending, of course, was in decline as we withdrew from Vietnam.
Right. And so they needed to keep the big companies on the dole, right? Keep them happy. And so the military-industrial complex firms. And so this was one of the ways that they did it. But the Shah couldn't really afford it. And it really helped to undermine his rule in the country, which is a very poor country. And he's buying all this first world military equipment on the taxpayers' dime there. And there's a clip of Jimmy Carter toasting the Shah at his birthday and calling him Your Majesty and saying, the stability of your country is a testament to your people's love for your rule over them. And people can find that on YouTube. And this is just months before the revolution breaks out. And what had happened with the revolution was that the Shah's rule was weakened because he had cancer and he had to leave the country anyway to try to get cancer treatment. And the revolution was breaking out all over the country. And it was a real popular revolution. But I did find footage of the Ayatollah on the plane on the way back to Iran from Paris, France.
Oh, yeah.
And he's being interviewed by Peter Jennings, who's asking him, so how do you feel about your triumphant return to Iran right now? And this kind of thing. Well, I remember even as a kid wondering, but aren't the French our friends? And why would they send the Ayatollah back to Iran to inherit this deadly anti-American revolution if that wasn't what America wanted? But the answer is, that is what America wanted. The CIA and the State Department had advised Jimmy Carter that we know this guy. Khomeini, he's not so bad. He was part of a Shiite group that we helped to agitate against Mohammad Mossadegh back in 1953. We can work with him. And a State Department guy named William Sullivan, I believe he was the ambassador, William Sullivan compared him to Mahatma Gandhi. And so...
I remember this. And in fact, I remember one of the hostages, a State Department guy, possibly a CIA guy, but who, spent 444 days in the embassy, when he got out saying, wow, I miscalled that one. Because I think it was a pretty conventional view that the Ayatollah was more reasonable than he turned out to be.
The revolution was successful by February 1979. America spent the rest of the year between then and November trying to work with the Ayatollah's new government and warning him about threats from Saddam Hussein, who was a former CIA asset and who had just taken over Iraq in a bloody coup against his predecessor, al-Bakr, that same year. And they were warning the Ayatollah's new regime about threats from Saddam and threats from the USSR and the potential that the Soviet Union would invade Iran throughout that year. But then what happened was that in November, David Rockefeller, who was the chairman of the Chase Manhattan Bank and the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an extremely influential guy, sort of the George Soros of his day, very politically influential billionaire type. He intervened with Carter and asked Carter to let the Shah into the United States for cancer treatment. And that was what caused the riot, because the signal was sent that, at least they interpreted it that to mean America was going to nurse the Shah back to health and then reinstall him in power in a counter-revolution. And so that was when, and it very well may have been the IRGC and the Revolutionary Guard Corps that started the riot. They say it was a spontaneous student uprising thing, who knows? But that was when they sacked the embassy and seized the hostages. Obviously not justifying that, but it's just, that was obviously the CIA station in the country is in the embassy. That was where they had waged the counter-revolution of 53, the coup d'etat of 53, to reinstall the Shah then. And that was what led to the sacking of the embassy.
That's fascinating.
So that wasn't until November of 79.
So from February to November, we were in contact with the Ayatollah. The U.S. government was in contact. What do we know what David Rockefeller's motive would be?
I think the Shah was his friend and he was dying. And he's
just
like
straightforward.
Yeah, I believe that was the whole of it.
He was in Mexico, I think, before he came to the United States.
Right. And so then that was what touched off the crisis. Then there was Operation Eagle Claw, where they sent in, primordial JSOC, right, to go. And that was a catastrophe where they were actually leaving. Enough planes and helicopters had broken down in the desert where they were going to turn around and leave. But then on turning around and leaving, one of the helicopters crashed into one of the planes. So then in reaction to that, Carter came in, and in his State of the Union address in 1980, he announced the Carter Doctrine. This was Zbigniew Brzezinski's doctrine, really, that said that now the entire Persian Gulf is an American lake. And we essentially are giving a war guarantee to Iran that we just lost control of, but saying, essentially warning that no power, read the USSR, better consider rolling into the Persian Gulf and trying to establish dominance there. We'll establish it first. And now, let me stop for a second, because I really should have talked about Afghanistan at the same time. The Soviets...
Same year,
1979, the Soviets had a problem with their sock puppet dictator, Hafizullah Amin. He was basically no good at being a dictator, and the country was falling apart. And so in July of 79, at Brzezinski's insistence, Carter signed a finding authorizing the CIA to begin support for the Mujahideen there. It was not all that much at first, but it was working with the Saudis and the Pakistanis to support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. The Soviets did invade in 79, and I don't actually have any direct causation there that they invaded because of the American intervention, but that is why America was trying to intervene there. Their idea was Vietnam was so bad for us. The word itself wasn't even a country anymore. It was a terrible, stupid thing that you shouldn't have done, that cost too much money and disrupted the society back home in so many ways. It was a disaster, a quagmire for our society as well as the army there. So let's not do that anymore. We had the Vietnam syndrome. The American people said, we don't want to do that.
Right.
So if the American people don't have the appetite to contain communism anymore, what if we bait them into overexpansion? Now, we don't want them to roll into West Germany, but the Afghans, they're essentially expendable. If we can get the Soviets to expand their commitments in Africa and in Latin America, good, because they can't afford it. We know they can't. So that's where the Carter Doctrine comes from, is we're trying to get the Soviets to invade Afghanistan. Then when they did, Brzezinski was trying to get them to invade Afghanistan. Then when they did, he said, oh no, now they might come to Iran. So now we got to announce this Carter Doctrine in the Gulf to warn the Soviets they better not come. Gareth Porter found, the great journalist and historian, found a document in the State Department declassified records where just 2 weeks after Carter's speech, Brzezinski admitted in a private meeting with Warren Christopher was there, and they were meeting with the Saudi foreign minister. And Brzezinski admitted that we don't really believe that there's a Soviet threat to Iran. We're basically just saying that.
Interesting.
But, so that was
why was he just saying
to
that?
justify the buildup, to justify the assertion of American dominance.
May I ask you to just go back 26 years to Mossadegh?
Mm-hmm.
So the convention, to the extent that people follow this, the coup was arranged by Teddy Roosevelt's grandson, Kermit, CIA officer in Tehran. This is the popular understanding. And the motive was Mossadegh's insistence that Iran get a bigger slice of its own oil money.
That was it. And then
So that's true?
Yeah. And then John Foster and Alan Dulles, who were brothers. Alan was the director of Central Intelligence and John Foster was the Secretary of State. They said, aha, see, he's a commie, which he wasn't trying to ally with the Soviet Union, but they were, and people always say that he was trying to completely nationalize Iranian oil. I think that's an overstatement. And I really should go back and research that better. But I know a guy who's a great energy reporter who says really he was just asking for a greater percentage. But they use that as an excuse. And see, the Americans wanted to edge the British out too, take the opportunity to get American dominance over Iranian oil instead of them. But now here's another big part of the Carter Doctrine, was given the green light to Saddam Hussein to invade Iran in the spring of 1980. Now, we know this because Robert Perry found the document where Alexander Haig, when he became Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, he went and did a tour of the Middle East and he met with then Prince Fahd, later King Fahd. And Prince Fahd told him that, yep, I'm the one who gave the green light to Jimmy Carter to Saddam Hussein on behalf of Jimmy Carter to invade Iran. When the Iranian Revolution is successful next door, it's not just a revolution. It's a religious fundamentalist revolution. And the mullahs and the Ayatollah Khomeini take over the country. So Saddam Hussein, minority Sunni secular Saddam Hussein, is afraid that his supermajority Shiite population is going to choose their religious sect as Shiites over their national sect as Iraqis and their ethnic sect as Arabs. And they're going to join up with the Shiite revolution and march all the way to Baghdad and overthrow him. So, and in fact, some Iraqis, Shiite factions, were leaving to go to Iran and to join up with Iran and to try to encourage revolution in Iraq. So he had reason to fear. So what he did was he conscripted all those Shiites and sent them to war instead. And he asked Jimmy Carter for permission and support, and Jimmy Carter gave it to him. And he launched the war to try to overthrow the Ayatollah.
This was right around the time that the Grand Mosque in Mecca was taken over as well.
That was in 79, right?
Right. So there was this sense that, just to kind of defend everyone involved, I guess, on all sides, there was a sense that there's an Islamic revolution that could spread throughout the Islamic world and destabilize every regime with a majority Muslim population. People were scared shitless.
Yep. And in fact, that same crisis at the mosque in Mecca was part of the reason that the Saudis and the CIA and the Pakistanis worked together to take all these kooks and ship them off to Afghanistan to go help the local mujahideen to fight against the Soviet Union. Oh. Better they go off and get killed there or do the Lord's work killing godless communists there than have them still in Saudi and in the Middle East, in the Gulf, causing trouble. Right? Huh. So all these stories are playing out simultaneously.
I know that to this day, the takeover of the mosque in Mecca is a raw subject in Saudi. Yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No, it's okay.
It's so interesting. Okay. I just think it's important to think through, like, what were people thinking given the time and place in which they lived?
Right. Yeah. Right. So in other words, Saddam Hussein had real reason to fear.
I think that's right. I'm not, defending Saddam or the CIA or the Ayatollah Khomeini, but they're as we all are, products of the moment.
Right. And so, it's an explanation for what was going on.
Yes.
Why he did what he did.
That's right. You may have noticed this is a great country with bad food. Our food supply is rotten. It didn't used to be this way. Take chips, for example. You may recall a time when crushing a bag of chips didn't make you feel hungover, like you couldn't get out of bed the next day. And the change, of course, is chemicals. There's all kinds of crap they're putting in this food that should not be in your body. Seed oils, for example. Now, even one serving of your standard American chip brand can make you feel bloated, fat, totally passive, and out of it. But there is a better way. It's called Masa chips. They're delicious. Got a whole garage full of them. They're healthy, they taste great, and they have 3 simple ingredients: corn, salt, and 100% grass-fed beef tallow. No garbage, no seed oils. What a relief, and you feel the difference when you eat them, as we often do. Snacking on Masa chips is not like eating the garbage that you buy at convenience stores. You feel satisfied, light, energetic, not sluggish. Tens of thousands of happy people eat Masa chips. It's endorsed by people who understand health. It's well worth a try. Go to Masa, M-A-S-A, chips.com/Tucker. Use the code Tucker for 25% off your first order. That's masachips.com, Tucker. Code Tucker for 25% off your first order. Highly recommended.
So now America and Ronald Reagan picks up where Carter left off, essentially with all this unbroken, and on the Afghan policy and on Iraq. So in Iraq, They supported him for essentially the entire 8 years of the Reagan years. And the war didn't end until 89 in a settlement. It was, and by the way, Randolph Bourne said, war is the health of the state, asterisk, unless you lose, right, completely. Yeah. But otherwise, Saddam Hussein's assault on Iran helped solidify support for the Ayatollah's rule, which was actually quite shaky at that time. But people rallied around the new regime because, hey, we're all Shiite fundamentalists now if that's who is in charge of the government that's defending them. Same thing happened in Yemen more recently. I know a guy, a reporter in Yemen, who told me, well, we're all Houthis now. I mean, which he's not. Right? The Houthis are a sect of Shiites from up in the Sada province. But they're the ones in charge and you're attacking us. So now we're all with them. The same way Americans rallied around W. Bush or whatever, right?
Rallied around Trump when he was shot.
Right, exactly.
Elon Musk endorsed him that night.
Right.
No, of course, it's a very familiar human psychology and it's understandable. I don't judge it at all.
So that's what saved the Ayatollah's regime, which may have toppled.
Chemical weapons were a big part of the justification for invading Iraq in 2003.
That's right. Well, we'll get there in just a minute.
No, but I know, but it's just like, so I have heard that, the U.S. paid for the chemical weapons that Saddam used against the Iranians and the Kurds.
And they even spun it for him when he used them against the Kurds. They blamed it on Iran. The DIA did a big report blaming it on Iran when Saddam gassed Halabja, which, was in Colin Powell's speech of why we have to attack them. And I was like, back then, y'all covered for him. I mean, Colin Powell was Reagan's national security advisor, right? He was in the administration at the time when they blamed that on Iran.
It's so crazy.
It is.
And just to linger for one more moment, we know that's true.
Oh, yeah. There's, in fact, at FFF.org, the Future Freedom Foundation, there's an article by Jacob Hornberger that I believe is called Where Did Saddam Get His WMD? And he has links to like 10 very thorough sources all about this. There's no question about it. They admitted over and over. Post, Times, Newsweek, Wall Street Journal, whatever.
Crazy. Yeah. And then, 20 years later, we're invading Iraq because he might have chemical weapons.
Right. And it turned out
no one mentions this?
Yeah. And it turned out years later, the only ones that they ever found in the country were from the 80s. Stuff that America had helped them purchase from the Europeans then. It was the only stuff that anyone ever found. And that was why they covered it up, was because this is stuff that Ronald Reagan and George Bush's father had helped supply them. And so we don't really want to emphasize that so much when the claim had been that there was an ongoing program to develop this stuff circa early 2000s, which of course couldn't have been further from the truth. But now, so the same time that the Iran-Iraq horrific bloodbath is going on, the Iran-Iraq war, America supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and this included, as we were just talking about, the Arab Afghan Army, the International Islamist Brigades or Islamic Brigades. And these were mostly Arabs, but included Americans and Chechens and Filipinos and people from all over the place, went and traveled to Afghanistan to fight, to essentially bolster the Afghan Mujahideen in their war against the Soviet Union.
I knew people who did that, yes.
And when I was a kid, this was an open secret. They made Rambo 3 about it. Where, in fact, the hero in Rambo 3, Rambo's mentor, Colonel Trotman, tells the Soviet KGB interrogator, we already had our Vietnam, now you're going to have yours. And that's built into the story. That's why we're helping to do this to them, is to break them. And which, by the way, I think worked, right? I don't really think it's disputable that the Afghan war was one of the straws that broke the USSR's back.
It was their Vietnam, actually, in the end.
Yep. And then the warlords that America backed there, our favorite warlords were Gulbuddin Hekmatyar and Jalaluddin Haqqani.
I remember.
Two of the worst throat-slitting, murderous warlords in the whole country, and ended up becoming America's enemies in our Afghan war later on. But so this is also the birth of what became Al-Qaeda. You had a guy named Abdullah Azzam, who was a Palestinian refugee raised in Kuwait, who was the leader of this Islamist group that bin Laden ended up taking over. And then the other kind of half of Al-Qaeda was Egyptian Islamic Jihad, which was led by the blind Sheikh Omar Abdel Rahman and Ayman al-Zawahiri.
Yes.
And they had all been, buddies together in Afghanistan. And so then, all right, now let's switch back to the other side of Iran again. So then we get to Iraq War I. Desert Storm, Operation Yellow Ribbon, right? So what's going on here is the Iraqis have just fought a war on behalf of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, basically, to contain the Iranian Revolution. Now Saddam owes them billions in war debts, but he can't pay them because oil's trading at, I think, $12 a barrel. He can't rebuild his country and he can't pay off his war debts. And they're calling in their loans and they're being real hard asses about it. And so he's threatening, essentially through body language, he's moving his troops toward the Kuwaiti border and threatening to solve it the hard way. Now, at the same time, though, Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney and Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy Paul Wolfowitz were alarmed. And they wanted to warn Saddam Hussein not to do it. And they made a statement telling him not to do it. But then Pete Williams, who later became the NBC reporter, he was the spokesman for the Pentagon, and he walked back their warning and made it seem like actually maybe you can go ahead. And I don't know if that was deliberate or just incompetence on his part. But then, so they tried, Cheney and Wolfowitz got George Bush to send a letter. But the letter was too softly worded. So they were like, no, we need to send another letter with a more stern warning so Hussein really gets the message. But by then it was too late and the troops rolled across the border. So they really, in essence, like figuratively, in the end, they trapped him into it. They basically encouraged the Kuwaitis to give him the stiff arm, right? And encouraged him to go ahead and get his revenge and take the northern oil fields. And then their warnings, actually, when they changed their mind and tried to get him to stop, were not enough to dissuade him. And April Glaspie, the American ambassador to Kuwait, told the New York Times, we didn't think he was going to take the whole country. He was supposed to just take the northern oil fields, but instead he went too far and took the whole country. But then Colin Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, and I believe he was the one who chaired the National Security Council meeting where they all decided they're just going to draw the line at Saudi Arabia. They're not even going to threaten to attack Iraq over Kuwait. We don't like it, but we're prepared to accept it. And of course, they lied. They pretended that Saddam was lining up his tanks on the Saudi border and was prepared to invade Saudi Arabia, which was a total hoax, never happened. And the St. Petersburg, Florida Times got Soviet satellite pictures that showed nothing but empty desert out there. And I've known guys who were stationed there said, yeah, they came and tested the border a little bit and left, but there never was mechanized divisions lined up prepared to invade on Riyadh. All they had to do was warn Hussein, you better not go to Riyadh, pal, or you're going to deal with us. He wasn't ever going to go. And then they lied about the atrocities. And the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the United States lied before the Congress and said that she was a nurse at the hospital in Kuwait City and saw Iraqi soldiers dump premature babies out of the incubators and leave them on the cold floor to die, she said, and steal their incubators. And George Bush and the PR people repeated this, senior that is, and the PR people repeated this numerous times as example of why we absolutely had to intervene for humanitarian reasons to save the poor Kuwaitis. Total hoax. She was not a nurse and she wasn't even in the country at the time of the invasion. It was all just a made up lie, but it was good enough to create the moral outrage in the country to get people to support the war. And yet there's a huge rub, a big wrinkle in the story, which is the Shiite and Kurdish uprising that took place about 6 weeks later after the end of the war. Bush Sr. personally, in a radio message over Voice of America, and the Air Force dropped leaflets over the Shiite army divisions in the south of the country, which America occupied the entire south of Iraq in the aftermath of the war. And they encouraged all of these Shiites to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein. What happened was they were on their way to Baghdad, but George Bush and his National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, Secretary of State Baker, Secretary of Defense Cheney, they changed their mind. And they left the Shiites high and dry, and they let Saddam Hussein keep his helicopters and tanks to crush the revolution. Why? It was because, remember when I said, when the Iranian Revolution happened, some of these Iraqi Shiites went to Iran and sided with the Iranians and wanted to import the revolution into Iraq. And that was why Saddam conscripted them all to fight the war, right? Because that was what he was afraid of. Well, they started coming back across the border from Iran, namely the Badr Brigade, which was the armed militia of the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq, which was a group of Iraqis tied very closely to the Dawa Party who were supported by Iran and had been living in Iran for the last 10 years and had fought on Iran's side in the Iran-Iraq War. Now they're coming across the border to lead the revolution. So this is the Bush Senior administration. These are all the Reaganites, right? This is Ronald Reagan's vice president and all of his men. Dick Cheney was the only new guy. He had come from the House. All of the rest of them had been Reagan administration officials. So they're all saying to themselves, oh my God, we just spent 9 years, supporting Saddam Hussein's war against Iran to contain the Iranian Revolution. Now we're importing it. We're going to be the ones to put it in power in Baghdad. Oops. So they called it off, and they let Saddam Hussein massacre 100,000 people or so in order to crush that insurrection and stay in power.
Oof.
That then became the excuse of why we have to stay at our new bases in Saudi Arabia, because we have to contain Saddam Hussein. The pretension was that he's going to murder every last Shiite in the country until they're all dead? No, I mean, the insurrection was over, but the pretension was we have to protect the Shiites and the Kurds in the north by having these no-fly zones and by maintaining the blockade against Iraq. And so that was the principal excuse for the Bush administration to stay.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. We hope you'll subscribe to it. And by the way, you can hit the little bell on there and get notifications every time we produce a video. We hope you'll do that also.